Thanks very much. I'm Doug Shoemaker. I'm the president of Mercy Housing California, and I want to thank the chair and the rest of the members of the committee. This hearing obviously comes at a pretty critical time, and I won't repeat many of the things that have been said. I think you're very clear on the problem. I just want to hone in on really a couple different parts of this situation relative to affordable housing that maybe haven't been focused on as much today. One is really seniors. So I think Dr. Bamberger did a really nice job of sort of outlining some of the causes and consequences of our approach to homelessness and the costs on the Medi-Cal and Medicare systems for that. I want to talk a little bit about that relative to seniors. One thing that's important to note is that we're on the cusp of a really impressive demographic change that I think a lot of folks are aware of. 35% of the American population are boomers, and 45% of those are over 50. So we are about to hit what some people call the senior tsunami, and the demographic changes that are already hugely impacting the affordable housing situation are only going to get worse for seniors. And then the second piece, which I think we've talked a little bit about, but not as much as perhaps is appropriate, which is just where we are relative to homelessness. I probably don't have to tell you, especially those of you from Los Angeles or San Francisco, we are the shame of the nation in terms of homelessness. You cannot get any lower than us. We're a third world country. We have 20% of the nation's homelessness and only 10% of the nation's population. In my hometown, there are 2,000 kids in San Francisco Unified School District going to school that are homeless. And you just cannot imagine a more clear indication of where we're headed as a society than that type of level. We have the highest rate of chronically homeless individuals and families in the country, as well as the highest rates of child homelessness. We're simply not doing what we need to do as a society. We are raising kids without homes, and we're doing very little about it. So Mercy Housing develops a wide range of housing. We work with fixed income seniors, working families, homelessness. I'm going to focus a little bit, though, on the specific difficulties of trying to develop housing in this environment for folks with extremely low income. So if you picture your average senior who's on Social Security, they're probably pulling a check that maybe is $1,100 a month, right? So what they can afford for housing is $200 to $300 in markets where your average one-bedroom could be $1,000, it could be $2,000. There simply is no place for those folks to go. You're working a minimum wage job, $10 an hour, or whatever it happens to be in your particular community. Maybe you're double that, $400, $500 a month. But if you think about the job of a home builder, whether they're a market rate home builder or an affordable home builder, there's absolutely no way to make a home, build a home, develop a home if that's your cash flow. You simply don't have the revenue in the building to support a mortgage, whether you're a buyer or whether you're the developer. And so that is really one of the places where the state has stepped in over the years and where the state is decidedly missing today. So I want to applaud. I think all of us are very excited by the cap and trade dollars. We feel like the legislature did a really phenomenal job of leading on that. I think we are very excited about the opportunity to develop housing for veterans, have already done a few projects and have one in development right up here in Rancho Cordova. And the Prop 41 funds and the cap and trade funds are really going to make a huge difference, as I think Carol Galante indicated. It's a big boost. But in general, the resources that are available to make a difference are so dramatically lowered than what has been in the past that I think you've heard that help is really not on the way, unless the state decides to do something considerably more muscular than what has been done to date. So I want to just focus. I think Steve mentioned, and I'll just give a couple more examples. In 2008, Mercy had the opportunity to develop a property right here by the rail yards. It's called 7th and H. It's about a 150-unit apartment building. It's right behind the jail. In fact, the jail was our NIMBY. They were the ones opposed to our development, if you can believe it. The land acquisition and pre-development funding on that was provided by the Sacramento Housing and Redevelopment Agency. It accounted for about 45% of the project cost. As you know, that funding is not available today. So close to 50% of what was used to build that project would not be available today. And I could go through a list of Mercy projects that we're finishing or have finished in recent years, and basically the story is the same on every one. Somewhere between 40 and 50% of the funds that we use today simply don't exist. Back in the day, whether it was 2007, 8, or 9, they simply don't exist. The funds are gone, and there's no money to replace it. So to the credit of local governments, I think a lot of folks are still trying to eke it out, trying to make as much of a difference. We see a lot of local governments using boomerang funds and trying to do what they can. But when this little dribble of remaining MHP dollars and whatever is left in the state funds goes away, I think we're really going to have a much more serious problem. And I want to focus on, I guess, 3 different places. For one, we already are seeing a massive drop in production. Depends on what year you pick as your start year, if you pick our high year of 2003 or 2007. But there is no doubt that the amount of the amount of development occurring in the state has dropped dramatically. I think Matt Schwartz is going to come and speak in a little bit about the state housing tax credits and the potential to raise that money. But just to give as an example, he and I on the car ride up were just looking at the numbers for 4% tax credits, which is the principal leveraging that we're missing today. We're not taking advantage of these not free federal funds, but free to the state in so many ways. And the drop-off in the use of those 4% tax credits since the days when we had MHP funding and were able to do this is over 47%. And so we're basically not producing all the housing that we could as a result of the state not having all of its resources available. And so we greatly need a new source of funding to leverage those federal 4% tax credits, which I'm sure Matt will go into in a lot greater detail. The other piece is it is much, much harder to serve very low and low-income households, even with the existing tax credit program. So for the reasons that I talked about earlier, the absence of public subsidy means that if you're an affordable housing developer, mission-driven, your goal is to produce as much affordable housing as you can, given the tremendous wipeout of capital resources, you really have very few choices as a developer. You can build to that group of folks that can earn maybe $40,000 to $50,000 a year. You can probably eke out a few family housing tax credit projects at that level. But if you want to serve seniors or families on minimum wage or homeless individuals, there basically is very little out there for you. We have mostly burned through the Prop 63 dollars, the Mental Health Services Act funding. We've mostly burned through the state MHP, the multifamily housing program from Props 1C and Prop 46. And so there's just very little that enables you to target that other group of folks that, as I think Josh and others have alluded to, have other costs in our system if housing isn't really addressed. And it includes those kids that are homeless trying to go to our schools. The cap and trade program, I think, is eventually going to be useful to us. It's a little unfortunate. I think probably some of you have heard the initial round of regulations really didn't do much to target this money in a particularly profound way to serving very low or low-income individuals. I think that the criteria that program was using is really quite challenging at the moment. It seems to think that a $200,000 a year executive has the same impact, putting that person near transit has the same impact as putting a very low-income family near transit. And I think that there's some significant regulatory changes that need to occur to that program. I hope the Strategic Growth Council takes to heart what the legislator's intent was in terms of providing affordable housing through that program. There's a deep need to adjust those regulations. But I want to end, I just want to talk a little bit about what Josh talked about, or Dr. Bamberger, I'm sorry. It costs nearly $5,500. We pay $5,500 a month through Medicaid, to house a senior in a skilled nursing facility, which makes sense on some level or another if you actually need a skilled nursing facility. We actually have 1,100 skilled nursing facilities in the state of California, more than any other state in the entire country. 10 or 12%, depending on who you ask, these are studies done by the Department of Healthcare Services and SCAN and other types of independent views as analysis, between 10 and 12% of the state's nursing home population doesn't need to be there. They're trapped. In some cases, they're trapped because they don't have the right services in their neighborhood. But in many cases, they're trapped because while Medicaid will pay for you to live in a skilled nursing home for $5,500 a month, it will pay absolutely zero for you to move into a service-enriched senior housing property. So while Mercy and Dr. Bamberger has done some really great studies on the work that we've done in this realm, we can house that senior. In fact, we could probably develop housing for that senior for about $2,500 a month all in if we were just buying up apartment buildings. But if you think about the average rent that senior needs to pay, $1,000 a month plus some community-based services, the Department of Healthcare Services estimates that with all the other costs accounted for, we could save $2,000 a person a month for the 10,000 people that are trapped in nursing homes today. So I've done the math just to save you the work. That's $240 million. The state's share of that would be $120 million. And we're leaving that money on the table because, as Dr. Bamberger indicated, we can't seem to overcome the funding silos that prohibit us from saying we can save $120 or $240 million in healthcare savings if we simply invest money on the housing side to care for that same population. But at both the federal level and the state level, we have yet to overcome this challenge. I served on the state's 1115 Medicaid waiver working group, and I know the Health Committee is about to see some of those recommendations. There are some strong recommendations in there around providing Medicaid funding for services, intensive case management for folks and homeless, in supportive housing, which I think will go a long way to defray some of the costs for services in those buildings. And there is the beginnings of an idea around how we might incent managed care plans and public health departments to engage with housing developers and local governments to really produce housing to help folks exit nursing homes or get off the streets and out of our hospital systems. But it is very, very small, and it really requires that the state step up and significantly invest in this population, because I think with some investment of the type that Dr. Bamberger described, it would make a huge difference to the Medicaid expenses in the state. But unfortunately, as he indicated, it's not going to come directly to the Medicaid program. So in closing, I want to thank you. I would ask that you think, I know you have a lot of things to think about. I want you to just think about this last statistic, because it just, when I first saw it, it was so upsetting to me. I've been burning in my head for the last 3 or 4 days. As a state, we have the highest number of unaccompanied homeless children and youth in the country. There are 13,709 kids homeless today in California. And I just think, for you, for us, for our future, that's an unacceptable number, and I hope that you can do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions from the committee?
If I would.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Mr. Pontel, you mentioned that affordable housing projects are kind of like the proverbial Christmas tree and everybody's trying to hang their ornaments. Could you give me some examples of some of the ornaments people try to hang on to affordable housing?
Sure. Not only, and it's interesting because I would argue that affordable housing is probably the most complicated development that you can ever imagine. Market rate housing is much easier to develop. So not only do we have everything that market rate housing is required, we pay all the fees, all the impact fees, all the development fees, everything associated with normal housing production. But in addition to that, affordable housing has to meet all of the energy efficiency goals, all of the environmental goals, all of the prevailing wage goals, all of the other policy goals that come through the pipeline that are attached to any possible source of funding. And so the challenge is there's not an analysis done on the ROI associated, and so we constantly have to evaluate, are the dollars worth the price because of those additional costs that are layered in as a result of getting a particular source of funding. And the challenge we have is all of our deals now require multiple sources of revenue, 7, 8, 9 different sources of revenue, each which comes with its own criteria. And so there are all of the policy requirements about it would be better. For example, in LA County now, they've added an additional limitation. You cannot build within a certain distance of a freeway, eliminating a significant chunk of land that could be available. So you can put, and it's for health reasons, and they're arguably good health reasons, but you can put high-end luxury condos adjacent to a freeway. You cannot put affordable housing adjacent to a freeway. And so every time there's a policy associated with another goal like health, then that layers an additional cost on the development of affordable housing.
Thank you. I had another follow-up question as well. You talk about CEQA reform, and you gave a couple examples as far as waivers, grants, incentives, and how we see CEQA can be waived in a lot of cases where it makes sense. Could you give me a couple examples where you think it would be most prudently waived or amended to help you with your projects?
Well, there's probably a couple of opportunities. One would be, when a city does a housing element, which is a requirement of the state, I would say, being generous, 98% of the housing elements are never read after they're developed. Maybe 97%, I don't know. But however, if in that process a city was able to go through and do, as they do with a general plan or a specific plan, some of the environmental analysis associated with the production of housing, so that a lot of that analysis doesn't have to be project specific, it could be city specific, then that would be an opportunity so that a specific affordable housing development would not have to go back through and do a complete environmental impact report on its project in and of itself. So there may be opportunities to identify those issues that can be aggregated and or those issues that can be waived or modified if you're doing a certain type of housing. So right now the state has a density bonus for affordable housing, that a city has to honor. There could also be an analysis of which of the environmental regulations can we actually deal with, either in mass or in a more aggregate fashion, as opposed to have every individual project have to do a complete EIR in and of itself. And so there may be opportunities to think about savings associated with that. And the housing element may be a conduit with which to be able to evaluate those kinds of opportunities. And so it's just a matter of thinking about it on the streamlining side, but then also, is there a way to put, and unfortunately, and I'll allow the other, development community to talk through it, but there are dozens and dozens of examples of where CEQA is used for purposes other than environmental purposes to stop projects. And I cannot overemphasize the levels of opposition that we face from different communities, different neighborhoods, different interest groups in producing affordable housing. And CEQA gives them another weapon or tool to delay affordable housing development project. And so one of the biggest costs we have is time. The more certainty we have on time, the better we're going to be able to produce units at a particular price point. And so it's both there where there might be opportunities for waivers and where there's the opportunity to set a condition within which we know we're going to be able to answer the questions, solve the problems, and move on.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Schumacher. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks. Mr. Chu?
Thank you. I want to follow up with Mr. Shoemaker's comments on the health housing nexus. I'm wondering if there has been a conversation within the statewide housing community and our state health departments on the best way to potentially structure moving some investment from health over to housing, if we're talking about the types of savings that you're talking about. I think you alluded to some of these conversations, but could you elaborate more on what has happened and what you think would be the ideal way to break down some of these silos?
I think probably the ideal way to break down these silos is not completely available to us, in the sense that the federal government has made it clear that they're not prepared to allow Medicaid funds to be directly spent on housing. But as Dr. Bamberger mentioned, I think there are other ways to do this. I think one clear way the state could do it would be to decide if it was going to allocate a certain amount of funding. They're going to set aside a certain amount of it to serve these really what the healthcare world calls high utilizers. They can be homeless people, they can be seniors that are coming out of nursing homes, they could be people with disabilities coming out of regional centers. They typically account for a much, much higher percentage of Medicaid expenditure than their percentage of the population. For example, skilled nursing represents 75% of all the Medicaid spending in the state. So I think the likely solution is one in which the funding comes through the housing side, but with a clear preference for partnering back to public health departments or health plans, and provides that those health plans, and this is what's in the Medicaid waiver working group suggested, that they be given an incentive through the managed care plans, be given an incentive in the next round of Medicaid waiver, which is, I guess, a 3 to 5 year waiver, in which if they were able to deliver savings in terms of cost, rather than having Medicaid pay directly for housing, which was not allowed, that in fact an incentive payment be given back to the managed care plans and their partners if they're able to do that. So it is not exactly a pay-for-success model, but it's something like that, in which I think there could be partnerships between either local housing authorities or local housing departments or the state to sort of, if you will, sort of prime the pump and put some of the capital money out to enable a combination. And I think the way it's envisioned in the waiver is that there would be consortia or groups or partnerships that might involve, as for example, I think has been mentioned a couple times, public health departments are very active in this arena. So you have San Francisco and Los Angeles directly investing in housing. The benefits they create to Medicaid are largely not returned to them. They basically spend general fund and they save Medicaid a lot of money, but it doesn't necessarily come back to them. And so you could create a pay-for-success model, or you could create some other structure, and I think this is envisioned within the waiver, that would enable the health plans or health departments that benefited from investing in that and lowering their cost to effectively partner with housing agencies and return some of that money to replenish the housing dollars or just invest in the next round of projects. And I'd be happy to talk with you more about it.
Great. I'd love to learn more information about that. And then one final follow-up question, and I think we'll probably hear a little bit more about 4% credits from Mr. Schwartz, but you mentioned that there has been recently a 47%, if I had your number correct, drop-off in the utilization of the 4% credits. Could you talk about why you think that has been the case, and probably maybe for the committee, if you could just take a step back and explain what these credits are and what this drop-off really means?
Well, and I think I will defer to Matt in terms of explaining a lot more about how the credit works, but fundamentally there are low-income housing tax credits at this point form the bedrock of almost any affordable rental development that occurs in the state of California. Probably upwards of 90% of all rental housing development that's affordable is developed with that program, and it can produce anywhere between 25 and 50% of the total development cost for a project. The 9% credit is capped. We only get a certain amount per year. The 4% credit also has a cap, but California comes nowhere close to meeting that cap, and Matt, I'm sure, will provide more detail in that regard. But in order for the 9% credit delivers a lot more money to each developer, which enables you to serve lower incomes or use less other money. For many years, I'd say back to 99, 2000 when Prop 46 was passed and Prop 1C, the state had an approach that said, in order to make the 4% credit as productive as possible, we are going to compensate for the lack of equity that you get from the 4% credit by providing additional state capital to make people want to do more 4% tax credits. But as that funding has dropped off, and Matt, I'm sure we'll go into it in more detail, the amount of production in that program has tailed off considerably. And I think that there's a lot of concern that not only are we not reaching our production goals, but that the federal tax credits that are available to us as a state aren't being used. And if they are not used for long periods of time, eventually, presumably, the federal government will say no one needs this program.
And if I maybe just add, and this was a point that Doug and I had talked about previously, the 4% tax credit's a tool when it's in an appropriate stack of other funding. And with the eliminated, you cannot overstate, not only was the elimination of redevelopment a loss of dollars, but it was a loss of dollars that could really be directed, managed, leveraged at the local level. And so if you had a redevelopment stack and you were able to go into a neighborhood and identify the opportunities for aggregating land and dealing with zoning and changing uses and doing everything that a city can bring to the table, you could then also use 4% more as more a part of that complete package. And so with the elimination of that standing on their own, they're a very limited resource.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Question for, first of all, for Mr. Shoemaker. Between funding and regulatory reform, in your view, what's more important?
I don't, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure I can answer that question in terms of importance, perhaps maybe just in terms of likelihood of success. I have worked on, I think, 15 different housing elements, maybe a dozen inclusionary housing policies, and about 5 or 6 different swings at the CEQA apple. And it's not that I don't think the CEQA reform that Steve is referencing is important. It's just that I think that the sides have really calcified, and there seems to be very little opportunity to meet in the middle on this topic. I hope Steve has made some very good suggestions, and I think if there were really an appetite for coming to the middle and addressing those, I think that would make a huge difference. And I think many things he's described are helpful. I'll just say that when I was the housing director for the city of San Francisco, we had a housing element that didn't even have a programmatic EIR because it really didn't require one, because it didn't really result in any zoning changes, and we still got sued under CEQA. So one of the reasons why local governments don't go the path, they tend to focus on program level EIRs, specifically zoned areas of town, is because, as Steve alluded to, there's just a huge target up in the air the moment you do a CEQA review of any public document. And if it's your housing element, you're going to have people coming out of the woodwork to challenge it on any particular item that you might have. I mean, San Francisco may be unique. I think we had a CEQA lawsuit on our bike plan that lasted 4 years. So we have some very specialized counsel I think, that are active in San Francisco.
Got it. Now, for Steve, I think it was you who mentioned about local funding. Does Prop 13 play at all a role in this equation at all? I mean, because Prop 13 obviously limits local funding.
Well, I mean, the entire tax structure, however you slice it and dice it, would have an impact. The challenge cities have, and it's fascinating to me that they don't fully realize it, because of their dependence and addiction to sales tax dollars now, as a result of all the changes in the tax code, they've gone from 65% of their economic activity being sales taxable down to about 35%. And so cities are playing a losing game, and you play it to the end, they're not going to have any discretionary income. And nobody has done the analysis of the billions and billions of dollars that have been rebated back to sales tax producers as a result of the negotiations that had to occur in order to land a particular development within a given city. And so the challenge is, unless cities can participate in a revenue stream that is tied to jobs and housing, and that would primarily be income one way or the other, if it was, if they had a commensurate amount of income tax, 50% based on where people live, 50% based on where they work, immediately cities would be participating in the entire economy, all the economic activity, and they would be incented to produce an adequate supply of jobs and housing. And so the challenge we have is, there are a variety of reasons, and there are distortions that we have in the market today that are resulting in the policy. And I completely agree with what Doug said. I unfortunately live in maybe a little bit more of a nirvanish hope, but my concern is there's not enough money on the planet to to pay for the kind of subsidized housing that we want to build. And so we can, we talk about cap and trade, $150 million after losing $1 billion from redevelopment. I mean, we're chipping away in statistically insignificant amounts. The only way we're going to deal with the issues in a statistically significant way is with some pretty dramatic policy changes. But I agree with that. I don't know that it can be done, but at least we have to make sure those conversations are occurring.
Now that he's answered, I feel the need to answer differently as well. So I guess I just want to say I hope that Steve's answer doesn't encourage you to feel like the incremental investment of hundreds of millions of dollars is insignificant. It makes a huge difference, and I think it can have incredible ripple effects. And I just would point to the fact that the state has begun to do some very targeted investment. That's both good and bad. The good part about it is it really addresses very specific public policy issues that are cross-cutting. The climate change issue related to transit-oriented development, the veterans homelessness issue, and so forth. And so I think that that's a really great strategy and has profound impacts on the state's budget and the nature of our communities. What is a little bit missing at the moment is a more broad-based effort to deal with the fact that families and seniors are largely left out of some of those equations. And so whereas in the past we had programs that were more flexible and their ability to reach a wide range of populations, and as Steve referenced, local governments had an ability to steer particular projects with tax increment dollars that meant that they could really get to local priorities. Today, the way our system is structured, it's a much more narrowly tailored set of priorities, and if you're trying to serve a population that doesn't sit within one of those priorities, you're going to have a much harder time doing it. So the comments today about firefighters and teachers and there is no program for that. And so if the state really wants to get it, and by the way, if you brought up anybody here, you could come up with 5 other categories of people that are also deserving of living near their work or living near their school or whatever it would be. And what you fundamentally come to realize is that we can have narrowly tailored programs, but we also need some broad, wide-ranging, flexible programs so that we can serve people where they are. Thank you.
And I agree with what Doug said.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for sharing your perspectives. They've been very insightful. Thank you very much. So with that, let's invite our last panel to come on up. They will enlighten us on solutions on innovative financing and land use tools. And we have joining us Mary Brooks, who is the Senior Advisor from the Center for Community Change, Matt Schwartz, who is the President and CEO of California Housing Partnership, and finally, Nico Calvavita, who is the Professor Emeritus, graduate program in City Planning at San Diego State University. And welcome all of you. And we can start with Ms. Brooks.